whether the night's worn shade would be safer than the glare of day. To move now was to court a greater immediacy of discovery, but perhaps avoid the palace's concentrated scrutiny. To wait was to risk the chronicle being sanctified and the truth being sealed by ceremony. Exhaustion and fear mixed into a cold lucidity. The choice was not a moral one of equal values. It was a ledger of consequences and the opening of a wound that might never truly heal. They set about the preparations again with a new, sharper speed. The scriptorium, in the small hours, became a theatre of quick hands and soft voices. Matthias moved like a man who had given up arguing with himself. His pen was an instrument of duty. The night pressed and the city's torches blurred into a continuous line of amber. The bell tolled again, and the sound stripped him to the bone. If they were discovered now, what would happen to the ledger's names? If they succeeded, would the marginal slip survive the Chancellor's eyes? Guilt had become a fuel and a frost, keeping him moving and isolating him from sleep. When the last fold was made, when the little appendix lay in place, and the needle of the binder's apprentice had drawn the sewing thread in a stitch so small it was almost invisible, Matthias felt both lighter and heavier. He had moved from reader to actor. The moral calculus had turned from contemplation into a sequence of acts with consequences. He thought of his family, of his mother sleeping on the other side of a thin wall, and of the ledger's names. Each a small life that had been bought for survival. He imagined them not as names but as faces, as fingers reaching for a hand they never found. As they packed away the tools and smoothed the last scrawled note into the small haversack that Ryan would carry, a sound like a wind moved through the scriptorium. It might have been the door shifting, or it might have been time itself inhaling in readiness. Matthias looked at the faces around him, Edda's jaw set, Sister Unwin's eyes steady, Ryan's jaw tight. They were a small and precarious band on the edge of something that could either seed remembrance or provide the world with another reason to tighten its fist. The knock at the door came again, louder now, and there was a different cadence to it, someone who did not knock to be let in, but who confirmed the hour. Tamas' small voice called through the wood, "They have changed the route. The chronicle moves at first light. You must move now." Matthias' heart hammered hard enough that it hurt. For an instant he thought of stepping back, of undoing everything and walking out into the city to reclaim the self he had known before the ledger. The thought was like a child's lashing at a candle, useless and dangerous. He wrapped his cloak about his shoulders, feeling the trimmer beneath his ribs. The scriptorium's lamp guttered as if in sympathy. Somewhere in the palace, the Chancellor would speak, and the Empress would practice her benediction, and the city would grow its new story. Tonight they would try to make sure that story had a small seam where truth could breathe. When the group spilled into the alley, the rain had left the stones slick and shining. They moved like conspirators who had rehearsed their guilt to such an extent it had become muscle. There was no grand rhetoric in their act, no public heroics, only the close. Precise motions of people who believed that small things might endure where trumpeted truths did not. They walked toward the binder's apprentice's lodge with the hush of those who step through a house where someone sleeps. Matthias felt as if he were carrying the names of the dead in his chest. He felt guilt as both a blade and a warmth. It cut and it kept him alive. The Chronicle's eve had been a long enough rehearsal of lies. Now the night held one last rehearsal of the counterweight. They had not yet made the final insertion when a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness, a figure moving with the ease of the city's watchers. For a second their breath stopped. In that stop was a terrible clarity, time shortened still further. The window was narrower and the night's margin more treacherous than they had calculated. Matthias stepped forward. "This is the only way we honor them," he said, though his voice wavered. "We will not let them be only numbers on a forgotten page." He did not know whether he had spoken for consolation or to command himself. The figure in the shadows did not answer. The city's bells began to count time toward the morning, and the steps they took carried the weight of choices not yet borne out. Beyond the scriptorium's heavy door, the capital practiced belief. Within its walls, a few people moved, hands stained with ink, trying to give the missing a place of hold. The chronicles Eve closed around them like a glove, perfect for a hand shaped by ritual, terrible for an honest one. At the threshold of action, as they prepared to sew the appendix into the spine of the chronicle's copy, Matthias felt the air tighten. There would be no clean ending to the work they had set in motion. There would be consequence, perhaps blood, perhaps quiet ruin. Yet he felt also a curious lightness. The ledger's names would be more than an ember in his palm. They would be, at least, present. The guttering candle threw a long shadow of his hand across the table. He folded the last page and looked at Edda, at Sister Anwin, at Ryan. Each face reflected his own, sleepless, resolved, accused. They stepped out into the night together. And over the city's tiled roofs the bell kept counting the hours toward a morning that would not be the same when it broke. Matthias stood beneath the arch of the old apothecary lane and tried to count the breaths that moved through him. Night sat heavy on the capital, and the lamps in the square burned like small, suspicious eyes. He had convinced himself all that day that he could be spectator and scribe, observe the attempt, keep a record, remain outside the violence. The ledger was folded in the inner pocket of his cloak, wrapped in oilcloth that smelled faintly of resin, and the convent candles where Anwin had helped him bleach some ink-stained edges. It felt oddly like a heart he had learned to carry in secret. He told himself that watching was a duty. The voice in his head argued otherwise with every cold gust that carried the smell of the river over the flagstones. They called it a cadence, the procession of the chronicle, the slow, ceremonial passage past the throne square to the cathedral where the empress would pronounce lineage and law. The city had rehearsed such movements until citizens could repeat their parts with the same exactness as a scribe copying a formula. Tonight the cadence would provide the window, a few minutes of the public gaze turned to the religious pageantry. Enough time, Mara had said, to scatter names like a benediction. He watched Mara from the shadow as she crouched at the lip of the alley, a small bundle of folded sheets, each one heavy with type, each name a damning weight. Her face was a blade, her eyes shadowed in ways that made them look indecently large. Around her, Thomas moved like a fish through reeds, his bundle underarm and his jaw set. Edda leaned against a pillar, hands tucked inside sleeves, eyes tracking the square as if memorizing where every pair of boots would stand. Ryan, when he came into view, kept his hand on the hilt of a short sword that had not left him since the insular days of his redemption. The broad lines of his shoulders made Matthias think of a bookend, something meant to hold a terrible library upright. The plan had seemed simple in theory and savage in effect. Mara's group would scatter lists, small sheets, printed in cheap, crude type that Jasper's presses could churn out by the dozen. They would not shout nor carry banners. The names would be the voice. Mats and Edda would be in the crowd to see. Ryan would be at the rear to keep watch for soldiers. They would throw the names into the air as the procession passed, let them fall into laps, onto the smooth flanks of officials, into the hands of clerks who looked. That night, like deliverers of the state's conscience. The images would be uncontainable and live in the city's rumor mill, names on the pavement, names read aloud by children. It had seemed at once theatrical and true in the way that a bell's ring can be true. As the great drums began their slow beat, with torches held by guildsmen whose faces were dry with ritual, Matthias felt his certainty breach. He had rehearsed 100 ways the city might react: shock, denial, violence, indifference. He had never rehearsed the look on his mother's face when an errant rumor made her weep for the dead. He had never rehearsed the possibility that paper could be made to lie as well as truth. The first handful of lists were thrown. They flew like startled birds, pale rectangles flashing in the torchlight, a brief constellation of paper. For a second the square transformed into an image he felt he had read in a banned pamphlet as a boy, names raining like confetti, an ephemeral hail. A hush rolled through the crowd, not silence so much as a collective intake, the breath that testimony takes when it is heard. Someone laughed, half incredulous, and that laugh snagged and broke into a shout. A clerk at the edge of the square stooped, snatched a sheet and read from it aloud, "Thaddeus at the river." All of the northern mills' voices took the names, some reverent, some mocking, and what had been private paper became public sound. Then the guards moved. They did not first speak. They surged, a dark wave of crested helms and leather, the metallic clothing of the state answering the human noise with an instrument it understood force. The first hand that closed around a wrist was big enough to bruise bone. Someone's scarf tore. A lantern toppled and clawed the pavement with flame like a living thing. Matthias felt the crush of shoulders. A man cursing was knelt upon with the efficient pity of a city that maintains order by seeing trouble as a weed to be pulled. Ryan's shout cut through the cacophony, not loud but absolute. "Back!" he ordered. The word was a wedge. Ryan found Matthias 2 paces from the arch, where the alley narrowed and the press would funnel. "Matthias!" he said, and for a moment the soldier in him was younger, the tone less official and more a demand from a comrade. A woman scrambled on the cobbles, handfuls of sheets scattering like leaves. A guard's boot came down. The woman's face, familiar from the markets, was the color of old paper. Matthias' hands moved before he could understand why. He grabbed at a sheet, at the fabric of its truth, and tore a small corner to shield it in the palm of his fist. He forced himself into the crowd, not to scatter but to gather, to rescue what he could of the names. He had spent nights learning to conserve ink, to read faded lines until their thinness made sense. Tonight he fished names from the mud and held them like small, wet relics. "Let them go," Ryan said to a pair of soldiers who clasped at a boy in the crowd. The man's face was tight with a strange, public fury. He shoved, then hesitated, as if conscience had to be wrestled with like a recalcitrant cart. The boy went down. A hand flashed a slap. The boy's bundle spilled and a small wind carried sheets into a fountain where they stuck to stone and drifted. In the melee, the sound of paper became a sound he had not expected, not like rain but like wings clipped. A woman screamed high, clean, and its note cut through Matthias so deeply his fingers tingled with absence. The torchlight threw everybody into stark relief. He saw Jasper then, aside a lamppost, smiling with the ease of someone who had been paid to smile. He saw Jasper's fingers move, and had that odd, prophetic certainty that comes to him only when reading marginalia, a small, deliberate slipping of a sheet with a different weight into the pile that a messenger had dropped. Jasper's motion was practiced and quick. His satchel sagged. A piece of paper thinner than the rest, with a seal glossier than was honest, slid into another hand and disappeared among the genuine lists. It was a trivial act in shape and monstrous in consequence. Matthias saw the line of wet ink on the corner, the clean loop of a forged seal impressed not with age but with the light. New pressure of an instrument used in a workshop. He had thought once to ask Jasper how he could make a seal look older. He had been shown tricks of heat, of folding of dye. All the forgeries Jasper had shown him in the past had been for teaching, for the grotesque lesson that paper lies as the mouth does. Tonight Jasper had made the lie itself and slipped it into the crowd like poison in a goblet. "Jasper!" Matthias tried to call, but the word was swallowed by the crush. Ryan shoved a pair of hands aside and reached the lamppost where Jasper leaned, the man's smiling expression unchanged as if nothing of consequence had occurred. "You promised you would not plant evidence," Ryan said. His voice was steel under the cloak. The summons of his moral life had the bluntness of an old blade. "Only necessary contingency," Jasper answered without looking up. His hands were empty, the satchel secure. "Proof is a fragile thing. Doubt buys time." Ryan's jaw tightened. "Doubt buys them power," he said. "Not us." But Jasper had already melted away down a side lane, a shadow among other shadows. Matthias wanted to seize him by the collar. Instead, he moved to the fountain where the papers stuck to stone. A child knelt there, sobbing, and tried to peel a sheet away like it might themselves be a hand they could find. Matthias crouched beside the child and found, beneath a wet corner, the edge of a name, Ellen of the Dyers. The ink had run where rain and boot had touched it, but the shape of the letters remained. He pressed the page to his chest, as if the paper were flesh. There was more than force that night. A man in the crowd tried to pick up a sheet and read the list aloud. A guard hit him with the flat of his blade. A woman sobbed and spat the words, "Traitors!" The city's capacity to decide whether a thing was true or false had always been political. Now it was procedural. The guards, trained to recognize disturbance, could cleanse a square by brute motion. But they could not distinguish a forged leaf from a genuine one with the speed a riot demands. The plant that Jasper had made would become, in hours and then days, the state's single blade to argue that the lists were the work of sensationalists and Forger's proof that the names were unreliable. Matthias felt the logic of that danger like a physical ache. If the city accepted the forged leaf's existence as evidence of tampering, then any legitimate claim could be thrown into the maw of suspicion. They would call the lists a forgery, and in the same breath blame those who had distributed them. They would brand Mara's group as manipulators, and Jasper's leaf would be the seed in every argument the Chancellor needed. When the guards finally began to retreat, herding captives in ropes and clutches, the square looked less like a scene of civic life than the aftermath of a storm, lanterns blown, banners askew, pages plastered to the fountain and to boots. A man lay face down where the procession had turned. People stepped around him like one steps over a broken branch. Someone began to read a name from a sheet, and the sound threaded across the silence for a strange, clean moment, a private litany made public. Matthias found Mara crouched beside a child with ink on her fingertips. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, and when she saw him her mouth made a small, fierce sound. "Did any get through?" she asked, fingers stilling on the child's shoulders as if holding them in the world. "Some did," he answered. He put the names he had gathered into the inner pocket of his cloak. "Not enough. They will say it's a lie." A leaf was planted. Her face shifted. Fury and exhaustion contorted it. "Who then?" "Jasper." Her voice was a blade of accusation. "He had a hand," Matthias said. He could not then name the reasons. The need Jasper had spoken of in other nights, a market for doubt. The profit in selling both halves of a truth and a lie. He thought of Jasper's laugh in the scriptorium, the way the Forger had once turned a phrase into a coin. Ryan crouched near them, his uniform smeared with the city's muck. "They'll detain him if we find him with the seal," he said. "But they won't. He knows the alleys. He blends." Edda came to where they stood, shoulders hunched against the cold. "Thomas was taken," she said, and somewhere inside that announcement Matthias felt the thin thread that connected him to the city's many ordinary hands snap. He had known Thomas' lean face since he was a clerk. Thomas Rout had been the suture between the public and private archive worlds. To have Thomas taken felt like losing a page from a book you thought you owned. They moved away from the square in a small, ragged cluster, Mara and Ryan and Edda and Matthias. The city's music was still tuning itself to a new key, tavern doors closing faster, a few men running to the gatehouse to watch. A woman lifting her head and saying a name that had been in her pocket like a lint of grief. The air tasted of ink, smoke, and something metallic that could be either fear or the first hint of a dawn storm. Matthias' hands would not stop shaking. He could feel in the tremor of fingers that had been taught to steady a quill, the difference between copying and creating. He had always believed his office to be the organ that stitched narratives together, politic and careful. Tonight he had seen the raw edges of narrative exposed. How a hand could slip a lie among truths and watch the world accept the lie because it liked the comfort of a story that simplified the moral calculus. He had seen how easily a public could be turned away from the weight of names by a single, well-made doubt. At the edge of the lane they paused. A watchman, face lined like the margins of an old book, flagged them down. "The Chancellor's men are combing the East Quarter," he said. "Orders are to round those who spread sedition." His voice had the flatness of one who had seen too many enactments and who now read them without surprise. Matthias wanted, suddenly and with a clarity that felt like a revelation, to go back to the scriptorium. The scriptorium was not a stage, nor a square. It was a place of slow subterfuge. If the public square had been the place to speak names aloud, then the scriptorium might be the place to entome them in a form that the state could not so easily dismiss without revealing its own hands. "We can't simply repeat tonight," Edda said. "They use any slip to declare the whole thing a fraud." Mara wiped her hands on her cloak. "What do you propose?" she asked him. Matthias felt in his chest, the ledger's small bulk like a sleeping thing, the choice pressed like the tip of a quill. If he kept the ledger hidden, the names would stay mostly silent. If he tried again in the square, the state would use the planted forgery to discredit everything. He understood with a scribe's cold arithmetic that truth without provenance became rumor. But he also knew that provenance, officialization, the thing that made the chronicle law, could itself be altered, inscribed if one had access. "We go to the scriptorium," he said. "Tonight." Ryan's face was a map of exhaustion. "You'll put yourself at mortal risk." Matthias surprised himself by smiling, a small, unentertaining thing. "So will everyone else," he said. "If the chronicle is sanctified tomorrow as if nothing happened, this city will have a new foundation laid on a lie. I cannot live under that, nor can I let Thomas be the price." They made their way through alleys where the night's work had been done. A cloak hung on a nail where someone had been dragged away, a woman's bundle dropped and forgotten. A child's voice saying a name into the dark and waiting for the answer of another. Sparrow-wing shadows played across walls. The scriptorium's door was a pale rectangle in the gloom when they came upon it, its lock and old. Familiar thing that yielded to Galen's old key left in a discreet drawer behind the master's desk. Galen himself was not there. He had been summoned earlier and had not returned. That absence felt like a book with a torn page. Inside, the smell of parchment and ink rose like a blessing. The place had not the life it had in day. Benches sat empty and the light from a single guttering lamp made elongated pools of gold. Manuscripts slept in their presses. The Chronicle's official copy lay beneath its cloth in an inner room, sealed for the morning. Matthias thought of the pages as a promise. He had spent months polishing those pages for a public that did not forgive blemish. Tonight, those pages offered a different promise, a chance to house the names not as flung confetti, but as marginal truth, as a record that would not be snuffed out by a single allegation of forgery. Edda closed the door quietly and set a chair against it. Ryan stood like a sentinel. Mara took from her cloak a wetted plate of ink and a small bundle of pages that had not been exposed to the square. She had printed more copies. The presses had not been silent that night. Thomas' name was not among them. That absence burned within Matthias like a red coal. "We must be precise," Edda said. "A leaf here, a note there. Something the Chancellor cannot burn without exposing his own hand." Matthias felt the ledger's shape in his pocket, and knew then, a thing he had not allowed himself to admit. To put the names to parchment in a space both public and official inside the Chronicle would be to make them immovable in a way the square could not accomplish. It would be small marginalia, an appendix, a notation, but within the Chronicle's ritual, appending would be almost sacramental. It would mean stamping the ledger's witness inside the state's document, and by doing so, forcing the state to face its own contradictions. He thought of the forged leaf planted in the square and felt a dry bile of fury that was not wholly his. Jasper had not only sound doubt. He had invited the state to claim its need for control and to use that claim as an excuse for sweeping arrests. The scribe in Matthias remembered the old training: preserve the text, safeguard the truth. The man in him trembled at the cost. If we do this, Ryan said, they will call it treason. They'll call anything treason that forces them to mend their story, Mara answered. If they have to choose between their myth and a ledger of names, they'll choose the myth. But we will have made it impossible to say nothing until the end of time. Matthias pressed the ledger against his ribs, as if to calm the beating within. He had spent his life learning to tidy things, to make rough edges smooth. Tonight the edges would remain ragged. He would make the mark and leave the rest raw. The choice was neither heroic nor pure. It was the trade-off of conscience for consequence. They prepared in the low light, distributing rolls of thin paper, sealing wax, and the tiniest of blades. The scriptorium's tools felt heavier now than they had at any former hour. Outside, the city lay like a sleeping animal that had been pricked awake and now would not settle. When he finally sat down to write, Matthias felt as if he had become two people: the clerk who knew the forms and the son who had been taught to keep his head low. He dipped his pen and listened to the street, the distant calls of patrols, the low thrum of a city that would awake, perhaps decide to forget. The ink bled a steady black onto the thin paper. He wrote names slowly, reverently, as if the act itself might conjure the ghost of those who had no place at the city's table. Each name was a small incision against the soft hide of the chronicle's public face. When the lamp guttered and a draught ghosted along the room, Matthias thought of the square strewn with paper and the boy at the fountain. He thought of Jasper's hand, quick and focused. He thought of Tomas' thin shoulders. The night's violence had not simplified anything. It had only made the moral demands more acute. He understood, with a scribe's clarity, that whatever he put into the chronicle's margins would not erase the night's chaos. But it could be a small, stubborn seed. They worked through the hours. The city began to hint at dawn when a faint pink smudged the horizon. The square would be cleaned, proclamations drafted, and the ceremony rehearsed until the Empress could recite the cleaned lineage, as if no shadow had passed across it. But inside the scriptorium, with the ledger pressed between his hands, Matthias felt the first clear shape of action. He had chosen a kind of theft of the state's own page because he could not abide a perpetual, comfortable lie. When the first bell tolled the hour, they bundled the pages into secure wraps. The next day would be a reckoning. Tonight had simply changed the terms of it. Outside, the city was stirring. Voices carried like possible auguries. Mara put her hand on his arm, fingers warm and rough. "Whatever comes," she said, "we ought to know we tried with hands that did not tremble from fear alone." Matthias looked at the small swell of paper at his feet and felt the ledger like a weight and a compass at once. He had moved through shame to action and knew, with a slow, certain grief, that whatever followed would not let him live in the same small ways as before. In the square a bell struck again and echoed like a punctuation. He held the ink-dark pages to his chest and thought of the planted forgery, Jasper moving like an old riddle among allies and enemies. The chapter of the night closed like a book on a lap. But as he stepped into the alley and felt the first thin rain of dawn upon his face, Matthias knew the night's violence had given him no absolution, only a summons. The chronicle would open again tomorrow, and when it did he would have to decide how to place the names so that they would not be dismissed as the travail of agitators, but recorded as something that had happened. He had come to the edge and, in the dark, had taken the plunge. Somewhere on the street Tomas cuffed. The sound was small, but to Matthias it had the weight of accusation and of hope. He tightened his cloak about him and moved toward the scriptorium's inner room where the official copy slept under its cloth. The decision he had made in the square and the betrayal he had seen would have to be answered with an act whose consequence he could not yet forecast. The ledger lay warm and dangerous in his pocket, He felt, for the first time in weeks, the terrible, exacting stirrings of something like determination. Outside, the city cleaned its square and prepared